everyone. I'm really excited that you can all be here, and I want to introduce to you our lecturer, who's a totally amazing person. This is Dr. Frank Perkins, and I had the great good fortune to get to study a little bit of, I say a little bit because I didn't learn that much, I didn't have the time. But in the time that I had, I got to study classical Chinese with Frank, which was an amazing experience. Frank is a philosophy of professor at DePaul, and he is taught lots of places in China, Shanghai, and he is a specialist in, particularly in classical Chinese philosophy. And let's see, here are a few other things I wanted to mention. He's written a number of books. One of them is Leibniz in China, A Commerce of Light, and another, this is the more recent one, I believe, Heaven and Earth Are Not Humane. I love that title. The Problem of Evil in Classical Chinese Philosophy. He's the chair of DePaul's Chinese Studies Committee, and he's on the editorial board of the Journal for Chinese Philosophy. What really is very unique and exciting about what Frank does is he's been looking at a lot of these, the Daodejing, and looking at it in a very cross-cultural way. And also, recently, the most earliest extant form of this book was found, and he's been very involved in looking at that and looking at what that means in terms of how the book has changed over the ages and how that reflects what's been, is classical Daoism, what's been added on later. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Frank. And thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. It's great for people to turn out to hear somebody talk about the Dao De Jing on a weekend. And I want to thank Althea because I know she's always super busy, and to organize this is I'm grateful for that. Probably most of you encountered Althea from her giving you some great help. I was hit by a car on my bicycle a couple of years ago and broke my shoulder, and that's really how we got to know each other. I came in for therapy on my shoulder. I also should thank the DePaul Humanities Center. So I'm a fellow at the Humanities Center this year, and that gave me a course reduction that kind of gave me the space to develop this series of talks. I wasn't sure what format to do, whether to make it, just kind of have me talk or have some discussion or what. I think for this first one, I'll mostly just present information, and then anytime you have questions, though, you can interrupt. I can answer questions. And I think it was listed as 2 hours, but that's a really long time for me to just talk. So I figured maybe like an hour and a half, and then if people have questions, we can discuss, or we can end there and talk more informally. I'll say a little bit, I guess, about what I'm trying to do with this, in this series of seminars. Because as I was getting ready, I thought, it would have been much easier to just say I was going to give a series of talks on the meaning of the Dao De Jing, because I've worked on it a lot. This is more complicated, because I want to try to talk more about how many different meanings the Dao De Jing takes on, and sort of what's the basis for that, and different ways of looking at it. And it's really kind of three lines of thinking that led me to that, kind of just thinking about it in those terms. So I first read the Dao De Jing in high school, long before I started Chinese. I think I was into Aldous Huxley, and I read The Perennial Philosophy through him, and then just kind of started reading more Asian philosophy. I was doing martial arts, and then I went to college and studied Chinese. But I've always thought the Dao De Jing was really hard to work on. So it's had a lot of personal inspiration for me. It's very deeply, because I read it so young, very deeply I think influenced my thinking. But it's very hard to try to write an academic paper about, and it's even hard to teach students to figure out how to explain it, what it's really trying to say. And I was working on this book Althea mentioned that's coming out in May on the problem of evil, but really on whether good people are rewarded or not by sort of divine forces or natural forces. And I thought, okay, I've got to write something about the Dao De Jing in this. And I thought maybe I'll write a little section, and I ended up writing a chapter. But as I worked on it, I more and more started to think, these pieces don't actually fit together. There's parts near the end that say, heaven is always with good people. And there's parts earlier that say heaven and earth are not benevolent, they treat the things as straw dogs, right? And of course, I found a way to fit them together and say this is coherent and here's how they fit. But I had this suspicion that I was kind of forcing it in that way. So that was kind of one line of thinking about it. The other one was these excavated texts I've been working on. And it's been really exciting in China since it kind of opened up to the West more. There's been a lot of archaeological work, and they've been finding a lot of texts. And most recently, they've been finding a bunch of them on bamboo strips from around 300 BC. And so they're really, I think, amazingly significant because they're so old and they're from that sort of like the central time of Chinese philosophy first forming. They're really difficult. Most of them were just published, translations were just published of a lot of them. Some of them are still untranslated. So I've been really excited on working on those. And one of the ones they found was a copy of the Daodejing. And that, I think, suggests, looking at that text, suggests that the Daodejing wasn't really written by one person. It was really something that built up over time. So that was kind of another line of thinking. And the third one was getting a little bit annoyed with the kind of snobbishness of scholars who were saying, this is the meaning of the Dao De Jing, and all these other meanings are wrong. And in particular, kind of any kind of somewhat popular use of the Dao De Jing, kind of more inspirational translations of the Dao De Jing, all that kind of stuff scholars get very upset about sometimes. You know, most scholars hate, I think it's Stephen Mitchell. I first read it, not first, but it was the main translation I read of the Dao De Jing, but he doesn't actually know Chinese, so he really is just kind of reading other translations and putting it into his own words, you know, and that kind of thing. But thinking that this idea of trying to find the meaning of the Dao De Jing and say the other meanings are wrong kind of misses what's actually most significant about the Dao De Jing, which is that it's been meaningful to so many different people in so many different contexts. You know, in a way, to say it only has one meaning and everybody else is wrong seems to really limit the text. It seems like miss what's significant about it. And I don't want to say the way I read it in high school. As a scholar, I would say the way I read it in high school was wrong. You know, I didn't know any Chinese. I was in high school, you know. But it was still really meaningful to me, and there was something that I was getting out of it, you know. And so this is kind of what I started thinking about more, is to look at all the different ways it's used and how to think about that, sort of what allows that, right? And just sort of, yeah, how to think about that. So, how many people have read, has everybody read the Dao De Jing? How many people have not? How many people have read the Dao De Jing, let's say? Okay, so a few people haven't read it. Today I'll give kind of more of an overview, a little bit of technical stuff with these excavated texts and the kind of history of the text. A number of names, but you have them all here, so you won't be able to remember them all because they're all Chinese names, but you have a kind of list of the dates and stuff of them. And then I'll give a little bit of the overview of the philosophy of the Dao De Jing today and some of the key ideas, the key concepts. And then what I'm thinking for the other two seminars is to just pick, depending on how fast I go, 5 or 6 passages and look at them really closely and look at different ways they've been interpreted in Chinese and when they're translated and that kind of thing. And I'll end today with, actually it's at the last slide that you have on the handout, list some passages that I'll talk about next time. So if you wanted to, you don't have to, but if you wanted to look at some translations of those and start thinking about those passages for next time, you could do that. And this other handout here, that really is just kind of optional. If you're curious about trying to really look at how the original is written, this is from a textbook that a friend, Esther Klein, and I are working on. Trying to teach classical Chinese, like to actually read classical Chinese using the Dao De Jing as a base text. So this is the first chapter, so it doesn't assume that anybody knows any Chinese. It has all the words in that chapter of the Dao De Jing. So you should be able to, if you wanted to, learn these words and then think about how you would translate it yourself. So anyway, if you want to do that, this is one of the passages I'll talk about next time, but it's just sort of optional if you want to work on it. Okay, so talking about the Dao De Jing taking on all these different meanings. I've expanded what was in the flyer because I've done more research, and there's even more versions of the Dao De Jing than I originally said, actually. So it's estimated that there's 700 Chinese commentaries on the Dao De Jing. Those are really, each one of those will have its own interpretation, its own perspective about what's going on in the Dao De Jing. From what I saw, there's 250 translations of the Dao De Jing into English. I know a website that has about 120 of them, of the first chapter. You can compare all these different translations. But it's been translated from all different perspectives, right? So the earliest ones were Christian missionaries. You have people who are Christian, you have people who are anti-Christian, you have, a lot of it is along the lines of mysticism that it's being translated. All different philosophical schools, so kind of from pragmatism, from a kind of Nietzschean perspective. All kinds of perspectives that you could take on it, right? Some of them were interesting people who've done translations of the Dao De Jing. Aleister Crowley has a pretty crazy translation of it. He's one of the ones who didn't know Chinese, but I think, according to him, some kind of spirit explained the true meaning of the text to him. He wrote it out. Often pretty hard to figure out what he's talking about. But I'll give some examples of his. Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer, has a translation that she did with a Chinese person, so she doesn't know Chinese, but they work together on it. Timothy Leary has one that's kind of all in terms of psychedelic trip and sort of instructions for that. The German philosopher Heidegger was working on one, although we don't have what he did working with the Chinese philosopher. So you have really like just all kinds of different perspectives on it. And then various appearances in pop culture, and I'll give some examples of that. But first, this is, I guess, the earliest Daodejing that we have, right? So these are the bamboo strips. They were buried at 300 BC, so they're a little bit older than that. And Chinese, classical Chinese would be written from top to bottom, and then from right to left. So you would start at the top right and then read down and then start the next strip. And basically what they did was then just tie them together, and then you could roll it up and roll it out to read it. So those were the earliest texts. And this is of the Dao De Jing, or parts of the Dao De Jing. And then these are just some examples of uses of the Dao De Jing now, right, that I found. This is a real Dao De Jing quote, very famous quote from it. I'm not sure about the picture, because in Chinese, they always thought that the heart both has emotions and is what thinks, so the idea of pulling the heart and the brain together wouldn't work at all for them. But still, I like the picture anyway. Another one of the most famous quotes from the Dao De Jing that you find are out, right? A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The use of it for jewelry and marketing, Laozi probably wouldn't be very happy with, but you see that quite often with the Dao De Jing appearing in pop culture. This one also, I don't know what Laozi would think. A leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, we did it ourselves. That's actually not a bad translation of that chapter of the Dao De Jing. It's collapsing together the beginning and end of the passage. But this is, you can see a Ron Paul rally. I don't know if it's an official Ron Paul poster or not. But it's interesting, because there's elements of the Laozi that would support that. It's not a totally illegitimate use of the Laozi, I think. So it's an interesting use of it. This one also is interesting. I don't know what to make of it. So this is not a bad translation, except patriots is not a very good translation of the Chinese word, but it would kind of refer to heroes or something like that. It's usually translated as worthies. But in the Dao De Jing chapter, it's a list of basic criticisms of moralizing. So it says, it's only when families are out of order that people talk about the importance of family values, right? It's only when things are corrupt that people talk about being pure. And it's only when the state is falling apart that people praise worthy people, right? This, though, I don't know if it's getting it as a criticism or not. I don't know if this is like pro-patriots or anti-patriots. I'm not sure how it works, but it's an interesting use of it, especially how just changing that phrase to translate it as patriots changes the whole tone of the passage, The original, you could translate it as heroes, okay, but it doesn't have at all the sense of loyalty to a country that patriotism has. It doesn't have that meaning at all. So sort of stretching a little further, most of you probably have some familiarity with the TV show Criminal Minds. It's a team of FBI investigators who solve cases of serial killers. They always start with a quotation, and there's 2 episodes that start with Dao De Jing quotations. This one is interesting because I do watch the show, and the first time I saw this, it says, Laozi said, when I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. And I thought, that is not a Laozi quote. That doesn't sound like anything in the Laozi. I know the text pretty well. Later, I watched it on this Chinese website that has Chinese subtitles, and they did map it onto a Dao De Jing passage, which says more literally, by to the end, because to the end they don't consider themselves great, thus they're able to complete their greatness. So I would never guess that was what the original was from the English, but it's a loose translation, I don't remember what the case was there that this is supposed to comment on, what serial killer this is meant to describe or something. And then other ones that are much further away. So this quote, care about what other people think, and you'll always be their prisoner. That sounds like something Lao Tzu would say, but there's nothing in the Dao De Jing that I can think could even very loosely be translated that way, right? And this is a very common quote attributed to Lao Tzu, but not from Lao Tzu. This one, being deeply loved by someone gives you strength, while loving someone deeply gives you courage. That's one that I think Lao Tzu would not even like, right? One line in the Dao De Jing says, to love deeply or care deeply brings disaster. There's one phrase that says that in there. But it's generally about moderation, not being too attached to any particular thing. Like, this is a case where a kind of wisdom that's actually very foreign to the Dao De Jing is being put into the mouth of the Dao De Jing of Lao Tzu. This one I found really funny because I actually always assumed this was a Western saying. I don't know where it comes from, right? Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. But it's attributed to Lao Tzu in lots of places, but it's not from Lao Tzu. I don't know if maybe it's Chinese, but I've never heard it in the Chinese context. I don't know where it comes from, but it's interesting there. And then this one I found is just bizarre because it has no connection at all, right? Music in the soul can be heard by the universe. Lao Tzu never talks about music, the idea of the universe hearing. Even the soul is pretty problematic in the context of the Dao De Jing. So this is like a case where it's kind of any kind of saying, right, is being attributed to Lao Tzu. What's really interesting about all those things, though, is something pretty similar went on in a Chinese context. So it's not a kind of abuse of the text when it's brought into a Western context or something like that. I'll give some examples when we look at specific passages, but you have quotes taken out of context to illustrate, comment on wars, to comment on economic strategy, all kinds of stuff, right? It was common in Chinese context to take these out of context and, give it your own meaning. And you find lots of things attributed to Lao Tzu that we don't think were said by Lao Tzu in Chinese also, right? So the same thing that, like, you have a wise saying, that there's this famous wise figure Lao Tzu, you start to connect the two together. The same thing really happened in Chinese, right? So really this whole kind of proliferation of meanings is really not very different from what goes on in the Chinese, and when we look at some specific chapters, you'll see how wrong some of the interpretations will seem, some of the Chinese interpretations, right? Just like they seem so far from what it seems like the text is trying to say, because everybody's trying to use it for their own purposes and their own thing. I think, though, in thinking about this use of the text and how it kind of spreads out and takes on all these different meanings, I think it's a strong point of the text in a way, right? And that's really, I think, what defines a classic, is that it can take on all different meanings in different contexts. And I'm going to say too much about it, but if you think just a little bit about reading ancient texts and interpreting ancient texts, right, there's got to be this kind of pull between two forces, right? Because for these texts, like, we'd never be able to think like Lao Tzu or think like any of these ancient figures, because their world was just too different from ours, right? I mean, they didn't have any technology, family situations was different, government was different, everything was different. So any way that we read it is going to be some degree our meaning that we're not putting on the text, but it's still our meaning, right? And the thing is, if you couldn't do that, if somehow it really had its own meaning fixed and you read it like Lao Tzu meant it, it wouldn't be relevant to us because our world is just so different. Like, it wouldn't be meaningful at all to us anymore, right? So for it to even be significant, it has to, in a way, have a loose grip on its meaning so that we can then apply it in our different circumstances. What's confusing about it to think about, or hard to think about, is, on the other hand, ideally you read ancient things because you want to get new perspectives and new ideas. So it can't be entirely you imposing your meaning, because then it's just sort of a mirror to what you already think. And some people read that way, and some people translate it that way, right? But that's not what you want to do. That's a waste of time, really, right? You want to be able to get new ideas out of it. And so there's some complicated way in which the text imposes itself on us at the same time that we kind of impose our meaning on the text somehow, right? And I think with the Dao De Jing, it's just almost perfect middle ground between those, in that it's able to still convey a message in so many different contexts, so it's able to convey a message, but that's able to be taken up in so many different contexts. And I think that's part of what makes the text so widely popular. You know, I mean, from what I hear, it's the most widely translated text after the Bible, right? Certainly the most widely known Chinese text, right? And all over the world, it's spread around, right? Okay. So then let me just give you some more technical things about the text. For those of you who've read it, are very familiar with it, this will all be stuff that you know, right? So Jing means classic, and then so it's really the classic of Dao, and Dao meaning the path or the way. Da, I'll talk more about, it's a very hard term to get, but it's often translated as virtue or power or efficacy, something like that. It's also known as the Laozi, who's the supposed author of it, so that scholars tend to call it the Laozi instead of the Daodejing nowadays. I probably should mention the spelling, right? So in Chinese, of course, it just says this here, right? So when you want to try to figure out how to write it into an alphabet, basically people just pronounce it. It's Dao De Jing, right? Figured out some way to spell that out. And of course they ended up with multiple systems for doing that. So the most common one, say up to 30 years ago, was called Wei Giles. And that's with the T, that's the TAO system. Now the most common one is pinyin, which is what's used in China now. So anybody who studies Chinese now learns it through the pinyin spellings, which is what I'm using there with the D's. But one thing to keep in mind, that means that if you see two words that are spelled slightly differently, they might actually be the same Chinese word, right? So that's something to be aware of. Okay, so anyway, the text itself, 81 chapters. The first 37 were called the Dao part, the Daodejing, the classic of Dao. The last part, the last 38 to 40, should be 81, not 41, 38 to 81, that last part was then the Daodejing. It's approximately 5,000 characters, depending on which version you have. It varies a bit. And if you've read it before, you can see it's very frequently rhymed. Nowadays, the pronunciation is completely different from what it was, you know, in 500 BC. So we often don't know how they rhyme, but a lot of it did rhyme. And also, if you look at it in Chinese, it's very strictly paralleled, a lot of it is. So it's sort of 5 characters, parallels, phrases, and sentences, and those kinds of things. So it's very tightly structured, very much like poetry, right? It's really written like poetry. The legendary origins of it, and I say legendary not necessarily to mean that they're false, but the sort of traditional view of it is that this was written by Laozi, whose full name was Lao Dan. Laozi, Lao, that character means old, and Zi is the character for master, usually. So like Laozi means Master Lao. Confucius in Chinese is Kongzi, Master Kong. If you know Zhuangzi, another Taoist philosopher, that's Master Zhuang. Right? So it could mean old master. Classical Chinese doesn't mark singular and plural, so basically any noun could be singular or could be plural. So it could be old masters, some people will say, and that it actually is kind of a collective wisdom from the old masters. There's a bit of a possible paradox in there because the word for master there, that zi, also means child. So, and Lao means old, so some people will say it's a kind of paradoxical name meaning old child, that's some kind of play on words, and there's images of him as an old child, or that he was born looking old, and these kinds of things like that. Lao Dan, that name, Dan means long years, so he often has long years in pictures also. So according to the story, this is basically coming out of a history that was written in China in the Han Dynasty, so around, I think around 100 BC. It was written maybe a little later than that. He was an archivist in the state of Zhou, which was like the central, really the center of China at the time. It was where the emperor lived. But he was from the state of Chu, which was now around Shanghai, so it's kind of the center of China now. But at the time it was a kind of fringe state that they considered kind of half barbarian. It was kind of just coming into the Chinese sphere of influence. So suppose he was from there, but kind of had moved right to the center. There's lots of stories of Confucius coming to him and asking him for advice and asking about ritual in particular. And if that is true, it would have been around 500 BC that dialogue took place. So according to the story, China was falling apart at that point. It had been falling apart for like 200 years and continued to fall apart for another 300 years after that. It was really a kind of stretch of maybe 500 years of almost continuous civil war in China, right? He's kind of in the earlier parts of it. So he decided to leave and to go west And as he was leaving, the gatekeeper, the sort of border guard, stopped him and said, look, you have all this wisdom, you have all this insight, you have to leave something for us, you can't just abandon us. And he just sat down and wrote the Dao De Jing. Right. Later Taoist religion will take Laozi as a god. So if you go to a Taoist temple, like in China or in East Asia, there'll be images of Laozi as a god. And on that view, Lao Dan, that person, is a kind of incarnation of Laozi, this god, who will come back at various times and give people messages at various times. And that's a typical image of Laozi heading west. So the significance of this, which is how it's still read by most people, really, right, is it first of all tells you the context for when it was written would be the 6th century BC. So it's quite old. It would be the earliest Chinese philosophical text, actually, if it was written then. The fact that he was from Chu but lived in Zhou is kind of significant because it shows this kind of move from these ideas that were kind of at the periphery, that were kind of submerged, that weren't known, being kind of reformulated in the center of Chinese culture. And there's a lot of scholars who think that these ideas probably did come from the South, because they're quite different from the Confucianism, the mainstream Confucian philosophy that we have. So different that it's hard to see like kind of where it came from in the first place. It makes sense that it might have come from another cultural area and moved into China from there. Some arguments that it might have come from a more matriarchal culture, right? Because there's this emphasis on the feminine there and various imageries of the feminine that might show a different source as well. If this is true, it would mean the text is perfectly coherent, like not just written by one person, but written by one person at one time, right? So if that's true, everything in the text should be deliberate, right, and should fit together. So if you find contradictions, there should be some deliberate reason why someone would have put those contradictions in there, right? So that sort of sets the way to read it. Versus if you saw it as compiled from materials from various different people, then you might expect contradictions that just happen to be in there by putting the stuff together. And according to this, it was written by, I've said a literati, somebody who was educated, right? It was somebody who worked at a library, who worked with archives, maybe divinely inspired, but still put into words by someone who was highly educated. That goes against another common theory people have, which is that these really came out of sayings that were transmitted by groups of practitioners. So could be different, it's not clear what, but some kind of physical bodily cultivation, people who were trying to achieve some kind of state of mind out of it, wrote these poems that were transmitted orally and then were put down into writing at some point. That's a common view that I think is pretty plausible, but this traditional view would be against that. It would be really that it was a kind of scholarly person himself who wrote these things. So this is very detailed, this is very technical, but you have it written down. Any text that old, right, is going to end up having different versions of it transmitted. And if you're reading different versions of the Dao De Jing and you find some significant difference between the translations, one possibility is that they're actually using different Chinese texts that were transmitted. So the main two really are this Wangbi text, and then the Heshang text. And Wangbi is actually the main one that's been translated into English. So if you read a translation that's, say, 30 years old or more into English, it's probably the Wangbi version of the text. Traditionally in China, the Heshang version of the text was more the dominant one, because it's more used in Taoist religion more than Wangbi. Wangbi is sort of more abstract and philosophical, and Heshang is much more practical. One other text that's not as commonly used is this text by a guy named Fu Yi. That was found at another archaeological site a long time ago in Dunhuang, where they found all these Buddhist texts, and they found this version of the Dao De Jing there. Or was it? That might be wrong, actually. It was a really old. Yeah, that's actually not right. That's a different commentary. The Fu Yi text supposedly was found in a kind of archaeological find way back in ancient China. So that, I don't know when it was. So say like around 900, they found this text that had been buried somewhere that was much older. And it does seem to be authentic compared to some of the excavated texts. So it seems to be actually an older version of the text. So sometimes people will use that, but it's not translated very often. Now we have these excavated texts. The first one is the bamboo strips that I showed you. That's the oldest one from 300 BC. The one that's kind of been most famous is called the Mawangdui ones. They're written on silk The earliest one of those two seems to have been written down before 195 BCE, so pretty old. And then recently, Peking University was given a bunch of bamboo strips that were, well, looted from somewhere and stolen from somewhere. Nobody knows where they came from, actually. But they ended up at Peking University, and that has a complete version of the Daodejing in there also from about 100 BC. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those, but in reverse order, because as you go through time, of course, they get closer to the text that we know as the Daodejing, right? So that's just an image of the Peking University bamboo text. So these are written again on bamboo strips, and they would have had strings tied across them, right? This one clearly had one down the middle because there's a little break in the writing, right? That would have been used to roll it up and to unroll it. There's a beautiful edition of it that they published. So this is actually like a fold-out kind of thing that comes with the edition of the text that was just published. Those are the Mawangdui silk manuscripts of the Dao De Jing. So those were not on bamboo, but written on silk that was then rolled up. I'll say a little bit about that. So the tomb was sealed in 168 BCE. There were two versions, and I said the one is before 195 BCE. One interesting thing is that it was taboo to write the name of the emperor. And so if you had a book that had the name of the emperor in it, you had to change it. And so they would generally substitute a word that had the same meaning but a different character. Sometimes it changes the meaning, actually, when they do this. But one of those was Liu Bang was the founder of the Han Dynasty. And Bang means like a state or a small country. So that was changed once he became emperor to this other character that's Guo, that is like in the name of China now, again means like state or country. So because this one manuscript uses Bang, they know that it was earlier than that emperor, and so they can kind of date when it was written. It's pretty close to the text that we know of the Dao De Jing. It has all the chapters of it. It has some variations that are significant here and there, but not too much. One significant thing, though, is what I called the Dao part and the De part are reversed. So what we know as the first chapter of the Dao De Jing, the Dao that can be named is not, or the Dao that can be followed as a Dao is not a constant Dao. That's actually chapter 38 in this Mawangdui text. And the Peking University one is the same way. It has that same order. So at least early on in the Han Dynasty, the order was different from the order that we have now. Like the two halves were reversed from each other. And then these are the Guodian ones. I put a kind of a close-up of it. If you could read Chinese, you still couldn't read this. I can't read it. It was written before China was unified in the Qin dynasty, right? And at that time, each state had its own various ways of writing the characters. So this is from the state of Chu, the one that Laozi was supposed to be from. And so it's a different script. It's related, but it's different. It's extremely hard to read. I can't read it. Chinese scholars will then go through and say what it is in standard Chinese characters. And then I kind of will work from those, right? So these were significant because of number of differences, right? So they were found in 3 bundles, and they know this because the strips are different sizes and have different handwriting on them. So there were 3 separate sort of collections of chapters from the Dao De Jing. I should note one thing that makes these difficult to work on is that all of the strings decayed. So they found all these bamboo strips, but the strings are gone, so nobody knows the order that the strips are supposed to be in anymore. So this is one of the challenges of figuring out, is trying to figure out the order of the strips, which ones go together and that kind of thing. But they can still know it's 3 bundles because the lengths of the strips are different and the handwriting is different. It has parts of 31 chapters, so about 1/3 of the Dao De Jing, but a lot of those are like half of a chapter or a few lines from a chapter, or a few lines are missing. So it's quite a bit shorter than the main received text. There's some major variations in the wording. Notably, it's missing all of the last 15 chapters. That's the only sort of big group of chapters that it's missing. And it's very hard to figure out how it relates to the text that we have. I mean, 2 interesting things about it. One is that everything in those strips is in the Dao De Jing that we have, except this text that has been called the Tai Shamshui, which means Great One generates water, or gives birth to water. The Great One gives birth to water. That's at the end of the 3rd bundle, and it's not clear if that was part of it, and like it was part of the original Dao De Jing and was taken out, or if that was just somebody just happened to write it there for convenience, right? Because that happens sometimes on these strips too. It's not clear. On the other hand, there's the only repetition among all three is the last half of chapter 64 is in the first bundle and the third bundle, right? It's very hard to figure out what would lead to that situation and how that would relate to the text. But looking at the content, almost all of the main themes of the Daodejing are in these bamboo strips that they found. I think there's kind of three things that are missing. One is what I said, passages on supernatural abilities. So like the passage on the cultivated person not being able to be harmed by wild animals, right? That's not in there. The one on the infant who can't be stung by wasps or bitten by snakes, that's not in there. But there aren't that many of those, so that could be just coincidence that they're not in there. Things about heaven are largely missing in it. Heaven appears a lot in the last 15 chapters, but not very much in the Guodian materials. And then, oddly, there's no mention of like the one, or oneness, or unity in the Guodian materials. That appears in 5 or 6 chapters of the main Laozi, but there's none in those Guodian materials. I put a little chart of it. It's a little hard to follow, I think, but you can see I've got all 81 chapters, right? So that's the 81 is the number of boxes. The green ones are the ones found in Guodian. So you can see they're kind of scattered evenly through the whole thing, except the last 15 are all missing from Guodian. And then ones that focus on heaven are in yellow. So there's 3 of them in the Guodian ones, but a lot of them in the last 15 chapters. And then the blue ones are the ones that talk about the one, and they're scattered around, but there's no overlap between them and the Guodian ones, or the ones that mention heaven. So this, there's 3, well, let me just say with this. My theory that I'm arguing, and I'll say this is not by no means established. In fact, one of the papers is coming out in like a couple of weeks, and the other one is under review. So these are really very new conclusions. I've presented in a few scholarly settings and things like that. But is that the last 15 chapters seem to be a kind of separate source that's then added with these original bamboo strips, and that the things discussing the one seem to be added also to those. So that's my position. I won't say that much about it because it doesn't matter that much, right? But my argument that I'm trying to make, sort of my scholarly work on it, is trying to say that these are coming from different sources and are being mixed together in different kinds of ways. But on the question of how they relate to each other, there's really 3 different theories about how it might be. So one is that you could keep the whole original legend of it. The text was written by one person, 500 BC, and this could just be somebody's favorite passages from it, right? That's possible. There's no way to know for sure. It's possible. The fact that the same passage ends up in 2 of the bundles makes that a little unlikely. Someone would have had to have accidentally copied that twice. But it's still possible, right? Another view is that what the Guodian is the original Dao De Jing, and everything else was basically kind of is less authentic and was added to that original text that was really quite short. The third one that's similar is that the Daodejing as a whole was really put together by taking several groups of people who were kind of had their own text, their own sayings, and that this kind of drew them together into the Daodejing, and that what we have is one of those groups of sayings, and not the other groups of sayings. I think the last one is the most likely, but it's, people are still debating about that quite a bit. It's by no means settled that that's the case. This, though, that doesn't, the fact that the Daodejing can take on so many meanings doesn't require that assumption be true, but it would partly explain why it does take on so many different meanings, right? If it originally had people with slightly different perspectives then put together in one text, if you pick out somebody, one that came from this group, that's going to lead to one whole interpretation. If you pick out one that came from this group, that's going to lead to a whole different interpretation. And for next time, I'll give some examples of that are interesting. There's an interesting split, in like the major streams of religious Daoism, they really take the Tao as rewarding good people and punishing bad people. And that seems to not fit the meaning of when I read the text, the meaning of the text, which is about things happening spontaneously and kind of against punishment. There's critiques of punishment and all that. But I think that if you, like the last 15 chapters seem to reflect that view, that there is a God who punishes people and, punishes people, rewards people. And it kind of like, if you take that really seriously, you have a hard time with some of the other passages that are like in the Guodian materials. If you take the Guodian ones seriously, then you have kind of a hard time with these ones that say like heaven always is with good people. But we'll look at some of the weird ways that plays out when we look at some more particular passages. All right, the last thing then about the excavated text. I mentioned how the Laozi always seems to have kind of come from nowhere. It's hard to figure out where it came from, what it connects to. One of the most interesting things, I think, is that they've now found other texts that are similar to it, but I think clearly have a different viewpoint from it. And so it seems like, well, actually the Laozi was one of a number of different groups of people, or people, thinkers, who were writing texts, all trying, as they shared similar concerns and motivations. They're all trying to some degree displace the idea of a kind of anthropomorphic God and talk about things arising spontaneously. They're all interested in how everything arises spontaneously. They're all interested in how in your life you can connect to that source and that can allow you to act effectively in the world. But they all disagree on what that ultimate should be named, right? So the Dao De Jing says it's Dao, but that's the only one that says it's Dao, right? This Great One Gives Birth to Water says it's the Great One. It doesn't talk about Dao in there. This one called Constancy First says it's constancy and then Qi, and then something like spatiality or something. It's hard to figure out what it's one of those characters they can't decide on the bamboo strip what it is. It either means like something, like literally that's the meaning of the character is something, or space, spatiality. But again, Tao is not mentioned as one of the things there. And then this all things flow into form, it's the one, it's the ultimate. And again, the Tao is not talked about as the ultimate. So they seem to have been arguing amongst themselves, but it gives us some context for seeing like what the Laozi was reacting against and what it was sort of, what its concerns were, that kind of stuff. I've been doing a lot of work on this. The Great One Gives Birth to Water is translated in a few places, including this translation of the Dao De Jing I think is pretty useful. It has the Great One Gives Birth to Water in the back of it. It's translated a few different places. The Constancy First is only translated in a journal, so it's a little hard to get a hold of. And then the Things Flow into Form is not translated yet, so there's no translation of it. This will give you a sample of those. The beginning of the Great One Gives Birth to Water, right? So Great One or Great Unity gave birth to water. Water then turns back and assists this great unity, and together they form heaven. And then heaven comes back and helps them, and that forms earth. And then it shifts so that you're not going back to the beginning anymore. Then heaven and earth work together to create, I translate it as spirit and light. It's very hard to figure out what the words mean, but something like that. Those then work together to create yin and then yin and yang creates the four seasons, and then it's cold and hot, and then dry and moist, and then that leads to years. But the word for year literally is also the word for harvest, right? So time is very concrete in their thinking. 1 year is one harvest, and you could really translate it as harvest or year, right? It's very concrete. And then it stops because that's where the cycle just keeps repeating, is the seasons, right? So this is just an example of one of these other kind of alternatives to the Dao De Jing, you could say. I kind of already covered that, the composition of the Laozi. Okay. I'm going to start talking about the key terms and that kind of stuff, but one more sort of background thing for understanding the Dao De Jing. Classical Chinese texts, right, these are written, they're so old, and the language is so dense and difficult that it's pretty much impossible for anyone to just read the original text, right? There's too much is lost. If somebody says they just read the original, they're lying, right? They're reading a translation or something like that, because there are points that you just can't figure out on your own. But what you have are commentaries then that explain them, that go back really far. So the earliest Dao De Jing commentary on some passages is probably from 200 BC. or 150 BC. So they go back, they're also hard to read because they're so old, you know. But you have a tradition then of commentaries explaining it. And what the commentaries do is they partly will say like, okay, this part doesn't make any sense because it was actually a mistake when it was copied and it should be this character instead. Right, so they'll say where they think the text has been corrupted. They'll explain words whose meaning is now lost, that kind of stuff. They'll explain where the grammar seems not to work or what's something strange with it. They'll kind of cross-reference a lot, so they'll say, well, this idea here is actually another explanation of this idea over here. And then they usually will give they'll have their overall philosophical view of what the text is about. And that's really where the main variations appear. You know, is this a text, is it a mystical text? Is it a text about sort of concrete practices? Is it a military strategy text? That's kind of where that will come out then, is on this broader level of the commentary. And so I put here the main commentaries and kind of most interesting ones, I think. The earliest one I said is Han Feizi. He's a philosopher who was called a legalist. It was one of the competing schools. It was focused on governing, you know, ends. It uses a lot of Taoist ideas in a somewhat strange way, in that the government basically should have clear rules that are strongly enforced, and the king should be empty and have no desires so that he doesn't interfere with the rules, right? So it becomes a kind of anonymous system that no desires go into. It's just like, you do this, you get this punishment. You do this, you get this reward. It's coming out of Daoism, you know, out of the Dao De Jing, but it's not the direction we usually think of for it. That contains a commentary on the Daodejing, on parts of it, and then a whole section of like little historical stories where there's then a Daodejing quote that it's sort of meant to illustrate. Other ones, Heshang has a full commentary on it. This is one of the main texts people use in the first place. His is very technical, very caught up in the kind of cosmology and the kind of theories of the body from that time period that he was writing in. He's a kind of a legendary figure from 100, he himself probably lived around 100 BC, and the story is that he was famous as an authority on the Dao De Jing, and the emperor came to see him and said, like, well, who are you to be commenting on the Dao De Jing? And he levitated up in the air and told the emperor that he understood the true meaning of the Dao De Jing, and got a position out of that. The most famous is Mawangdui, right, which is another one of the main texts. That's much more philosophical. It's more popular, I think, for people reading in English. Will tend to read the one influenced by that because it's more accessible, it's more abstract. An interesting one is the Shangar commentary, which is out of the Celestial Masters tradition in Taoism. It's out of a more religious tradition, and that's one where the Tao is interpreted as a god, and it's a lot about punishment and reward and those kinds of things. And we'll look at some passages from that next time also. It's interesting to look at how it gets read in those ways. Okay, so I know I just give you a bunch of information. I hope it's not too much information. Any questions about any of that? Like, I could stop here for any questions about the excavated text or the additions or any of that kind of stuff. Anybody? Yeah.
You familiar with this one?
Mm-hmm.
Which version is this? I can't see any reference to any.
I would guess it's the Mawangdui version.
Okay. This
I
is just
don't know.
a new translation. I think it came out in '76.
Yeah, so
74.
It would have
Almost-
been earlier than 73 because there's a quote from Alan Watts saying that it's good. Watts
Yeah.
died in 73.
Exactly.
So it would have been late 70s, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
that was actually the earliest edition I ever read of the Dao De Jing. I
This
had
is
that in high
this is the
school.
only
I
one I've
loved
ever really read.
that. You know, I haven't gone back to look at it to see
Would you say
what
this
I think
is
of it now.
from your span of study? Would you say this is like on the abstract side of translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on the kind of more mysticism side reading, but I think the text itself would be the Mawangdui text and would be along those lines. I'm not sure where mine is anymore, but I'll take a look at it and see. Almost all translations, though, are either the Mawangdui version or the Mawangdui excavated text.
How do you spell it?
The
Mawangdui?
Mawangdui is the Wangbi. Or in the Wei Giles, it would be PI instead of BI.
Okay.
it would be unusual if it was a text other than that version. Except then, like in the past, say 20 years, a lot of people use the excavated Mawangdui, the silk manuscript, because that's considered now like kind of the oldest, most authentic version. So almost all translations will be one of those two texts. So given when that came out, it would have to be the 1B1,
Okay.
I think. Any other questions about the text history or anything like that? Okay. Then, what time is it? Oh. Okay, I'll say a little bit about the key concepts. Again, if you've read the Daodejing, these will be pretty familiar with you, to you. If you haven't, then it'll give you some better orientation on the text. Obviously, the key word really is Dao, right? That's the Chinese character at the top, is the standard Chinese character. It means, you know, a path or a way, like literally a path or a road is the core meaning of it. And you see that in the various early forms of the characters. So one form has an eye and a foot together, and that's the modern version. This is actually like a head, this part, and then this is the foot part is here. But you can see the head actually emphasizes the eye, which you can see much more clearly in this version of it, is a head, but with a really prominent eye, right? So they're all versions of a person walking down a path, right? So it's either the head and the foot together, or a person between two sides of the path. That's something got messed up on my format when I moved computers for this part there. It looks like, in the excavated text, it's pretty similar to this version of the character it uses. So it's not the standard version. It's pretty clearly a person walking on a path that's marked on each side. And I really like that version of it. I just think it's amazing to have a language that's written like that. You know, that's such a kind of cool, vivid kind of little picture. So like around, say like, whatever, up until the Daodejing, whenever the Daodejing ends up, that it was actually written, Dao just had the meaning of like on the one hand, like literally a road, but more commonly the way that someone taught. Like the way someone thought that you should live, or the way of doing something, the method of doing something. So you could talk about like the way of a carpenter, right? It would just be like the way someone did. You could talk about a way that was bad, or a way that was good. The Tao Te Ching is the first place where you start to get that word Tao as a way of talking about some element of the universe, right? This kind of original source that generates everything. So it shifts to a kind of, you could say, a metaphysical concept, or an ontological concept, some kind of grounding for the universe. But that happens, Tao Te Ching chapter 25, I think it is, talks about that name, and it basically says, you can't name the ultimate source, right? It's unnameable. But if I were forced to name it, I would call it Tao. And so the way to think about it is really that the ultimate is not the Tao, right? The ultimate is something, not a thing, right? It's something that's unspeakable. It can't be labeled, it can't be grasped. The best you could do, though, is call it something like the guide or the path, right? Because you can't really say what it is in itself. And it kind of says Tao is not a really adequate label for this, but we got to call it something, and so we'll call it the way or the path. The second term, "da," is very difficult. In really early stuff, so say 1000 BC, "da" was a really important idea where a king who was good, which primarily meant sort of respecting their ancestors or treating the people well, would be said to have "da." And if you had "da," heaven would respond to you by giving you power, right? So "da" then sort of has the sense of proper behavior, it has the sense of power, and it has this kind of link to the gods or to the divine. As that idea that if a ruler is good, heaven will support him, and if he's bad, heaven will overthrow him, that became really hard to justify when you had 500 years of horrible rulers. Right? And so that idea pretty much fell apart. You have one philosophical school called the Moists, the Mozi. They still defend this idea that heaven is good, it rewards good people. But almost everybody else gave that up more or less. But then the idea of "da" kind of broke apart, because originally it was like, you do the right thing, you get a kind of power, you're connected to the gods. Those things didn't hold together anymore. And so the Confucians tended to say, well, De is still like good behavior, and you get a kind of inspirational power out of it in the sense that people will be impressed by you and will follow you, can influence people. But they kind of separate it from the divine, pretty much. The Taoists kind of go the other way. They separate it from normal ideas of morality and take it more as a kind of natural power that comes from Tao, right, from nature or something like that. So it largely loses its kind of moralistic sense. I think in the Dao De Jing, it largely still, it's not really a moral term. It's more a kind of power that comes from harmonizing with the Tao, right? In like some other Taoist texts that are more radical, like the Zhuangzi, it's kind of clearly not a moral concept. The Zhuangzi is very critical of any kind of moralizing, right? The Dao De Jing is too, really, is critical of moralizing in general as well. I put another image of the character. You can see the eye again. That's actually this part, right, is the image of the eye that gets transformed into this part up here. And then the part under the eye doesn't really look like a heart, but it's the heart. So it's an image of the head over the heart, or the eye over the heart. By itself, it usually means just kind of straightness or correct behavior, something like that. Okay, the next key term, this, again, like it's just hard to believe you have a writing system that looks that cool, I think, is the term Wu. So Wu means, it's really hard to translate. It's one of the ones I have the hardest time trying to figure out how to translate. Its normal meaning is to not have something, right? So to say that we don't have this, you would say Wu, that thing. So it means to lack or to be absent. It seems to be phonetically borrowed from the character for ritual dance, which now is differentiated just very slightly in modern Chinese from that. And so the original thing is this picture of the person with dangling sleeves that's supposed to be a dancer. So I put two examples of the early character forms of this character Wu. Some people think that Wu then actually has connections to early sort of shamanistic dance practices. Like that's one theory out of it. Because that same word Wu, so the sound Wu, right, is written by several different related characters. One being the word for non-being, one being now the word for dance. Another, though, is for, they usually translate it as witch, but a kind of shamaness, maybe you would say. Right? That's another one that's pronounced the same, and the character is kind of related. So these might all be linked terms originally. The opposite of Wu is Yo, which just means to have. It's an interesting origin also. You can see in the character it's a hand, and then that's an image of a piece of meat. So having is basically symbolized by having a piece of meat. So these are the two opposites, Wu and Yo, having and lacking. What happens though is you start to have uses of the terms without an object, right? So instead of saying you have a chariot or you don't have a chariot, you just have Wu, like having or non-having, and then Yo, having. And that usually gets translated as being and non-being. And it's pretty close to being and non-being, but less sort of absolute, maybe. So one interesting example of why non-being is a problem for translating Wu is that the text I mentioned, that one of these newly found texts called Constancy First, it says, right, that there's constancy and then there's qi and then there's this something, and then you have being, right? So all those are all still states of Wu, of non-being, but they exist, right? So Wu seems to more mean something like indistinct being, undifferentiated being. So it's not like absolute non-existence in a kind of Western sense of absolute nothingness. It really, I think, is between being that has no concrete form, and then Yo is when it has concrete forms. It's when you have concrete things.
Potential? Right? Potential?
It has potential, precisely because it has no actual form of its own. It can take on any form. Right, so the Daodejing says that in a number of places. It's because it's empty that it can be endlessly productive of other things. And I think one way, this is maybe just, it's a very abstract philosophical problem, right? But Western philosophy often talks about how do you get something from nothing. I don't think that's the problem in Chinese philosophy. I think the problem in Chinese philosophy is how do you get concrete things out of some kind of unity? How do you get distinctness out of unity, say, right? So it's not, Wu is not like radical non-being, where then you could say, well, how could being ever come out of nothing? it's more a kind of undifferentiated existence that then takes on concrete forms and goes out of concrete forms, you know, or the concrete forms go back into it. That's a better way to put it. And then this one, probably everybody knows the term Wu Wei, right? That's the same Wu that means non-being or lack. And then Wei means to do or to act or to strive. It's a very kind of normal sort of pedestrian verb in classical Chinese meaning to do something. But it can have a sense of doing something with a purpose. And an interesting thing in these excavated texts that they found in the bamboo strips is a version of Wei that combines Wei, the normal character, with the heart. And that character was lost over time, so you don't have that character anymore in modern Chinese, or anywhere. Like even in ancient texts, it was eliminated out of them. This is not a word anymore. But it seems to be a kind of action that involves the mind, right? That involves deliberation. And this Dao De Jing text written on bamboo strips uses that way, actually. So it seems to be emphasizing not just action, but deliberate action, right? So intentional action or striving. The problem with the phrase is always that it doesn't mean to just like sit around and do nothing at all. So to translate it as non-action is always misleading. It's hard to figure out how to translate it. I put here a famous phrase from the Dao De Jing that I think is usually mistranslated, although again I'm a kind of minority opinion on this. But it's usually translated as non-action. This is Wu, that's Wei, right? So you don't act or non-action, but nothing is left undone, right? So it switches from active voice to passive voice. You don't do anything, but everything is done. But literally, it actually just says not having action and not having no actions, right? This is just a negation of a verb, that Wu there. So it seems to be trying to say like, okay, look, I keep talking about non-action, but you also don't want to have doing nothing, right? So don't act, but don't not act. That seems to be what it's saying, right? And if you read the text carefully, there are actually various different formulations about what you should do. So some say, you know, act but don't act. Some say act but don't hold on to it. You know, don't sort of, grasp the consequences of the action. There's one line in chapter 64 that says, sagely people will, they don't act, but they assist the spontaneity of things, right? So they don't do something, but they still like help, right? To make things happen spontaneously. And the most famous example that's used in the commentaries is farming, right? Well, so like plants grow of themselves. You don't make a plant grow, right? But you still are involved, you know what I mean? Like you're still doing something, but you can't force it to grow. The Mencius, it's actually a Confucian text, has a famous story of a farmer from the state of Song, which was kind of like, they were the kind of the butt of stupid people jokes in China. So it was kind of like, if you were going to make a stupid person joke, it would be a person from Song. So there's a man of Song who wanted his plants to grow faster, so he went out and pulled on all of them. And came back later and they all died, right? And Mencius then says, you know, a lot of people make the mistake of pulling on the sprouts. The sprouts in that case is your own sort of potential, forcing it. And he says, but you shouldn't pull on it, but you also have to weed it and take care of it, so you can't neglect it. And that story, it's a Confucian story, but it actually gets used to explain the Dao De Jing passage in a number of commentaries, because it seems to be illustrating this kind of middle ground between striving and doing nothing, you know. The technology was a little too complicated for me, and I couldn't figure out how to fit it into. And maybe sometime we'll show. There's a movie called The Tao of Steve. Has anybody ever seen that? It's kind of a low-budget romantic comedy, kind of indie film. I don't know. It's got a lot of philosophy. It's kind of interesting, but the Tao of Steve is basically a method for picking up women. Using the Dao De Jing, and I think his 3 rules are be desireless, be excellent, and retreat. I think, and they all have some legitimate root in the Dao De Jing, but it's an interesting kind of twisting of it. But one of the dialogues in there that quotes the Dao De Jing quotes Laozi as saying, "If you do nothing, you won't mess anything up." which is loosely a translation. But he says this after this girl he likes shows up and he's getting high before heading to work. And sort of talking about the value of doing nothing. And it's all Laozi stuff, right? But all being used to say, like, well, just sit around and get high with your friends and do nothing, right? And that seems to be what Laozi is trying to say is like, okay, that's not what I mean, right? So do nothing, but don't, have no actions, but also have no non-actions, right? This kind of middle ground between these. Okay, I think this is one more phrase. Which is Ziran. So Ziran, the Z is just a reflexive pronoun in classical Chinese. So it means to do something for yourself or to yourself or from yourself, of yourself. And then Ran just means to be so or to be in a certain way. So the most literal translation of Ziran, I think, is self-so. It's not really a word, the English word, but that seems to convey it most clearly, or so of itself. Spontaneous, I think, kind of gets a big piece of the meaning, right? But it really is emphasizing that it's spontaneous and it's not being sort of determined by something else. It's coming of itself or from itself, right? Without control. There's a way in which, like, if you do Wu Wei, so you don't interfere with things, what's left is Ziran, what happens spontaneously, so of itself, right? The zi, I just put a picture of it because it's funny, but it's originally an image of the nose. And if you notice, Chinese people still, when they say I, when they point to themselves, they always point to their nose rather than to their heart. And this apparently goes back a long way, this identity of yourself with your nose. So it describes the Tao, right? One of the more sort of most important passages has a progression where it says human beings follow earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao, Tao follows Ziran, spontaneity, spontaneousness, right? So it describes the ultimate origin, and I think it's really meant to address, again, a pretty abstract philosophical problem of infinite regress. And what I mean by that is, whatever you say started the universe, someone will just say, well, okay, but what started that? Right? Well, where did that come from? This is a way of trying to end that by saying, like, on some ultimate level, it's just so of itself. It just happens. It doesn't go any further than that. It comes from itself. It doesn't come from anything further, right? So it's that on some level, stuff just happens of itself spontaneously, right? On a concrete level, you can use this as a way of living also. So it describes the way the things arise ultimately, but because things are always arising, you can sort of enable Ziran or assist Ziran. You can. That's the phrase that Daodejing uses. You can sort of act this way or allow this to happen. And as with Wu, like the Wu Wei, there's a lot of phrases using that Wu, nameless, having no business or no work, all these kinds of things. There's actually a lot of phrases with Zi in the Daodejing. Ziran is actually only in there maybe 4 times, 5 times. So it's one passage says things will transform of themselves, so it's Zihua. One says things will be distributed evenly of themselves, Zi Jun. But it's this idea that if you don't interfere with things too much, they will take care of themselves. Which actually is the Rand Paul quote. Uses Ziran. That line from the Tao Te Ching ends by saying, well, we Ziran. So we are so of ourselves. Right? That's that passage. All right. Okay, so then, again, this is familiar to you if you know the Tao Te Ching, but just for people who aren't so familiar, the main themes of the Tao Te Ching. On a metaphysical level, it's that the Tao is the ultimate, and so all things originate from the Tao. It's a cyclical view, so things originate from the Tao and then they return back to the Tao, right? And kind of constant cycles, constant patterns. That's kind of on the big picture of the universe. On the level of action, then, is this idea of Wu Wei, which is minimizing interference, you could say, acting, going along with things, not forcing things, not striving too much. I think all the stuff about the softness, the feminine, partly ties into that. Water ties into that, right? So there's one of the famous lines says the highest good is like water. Water benefits all things without struggle, right? That's kind of this idea of not being too forceful, of going along with things rather than fighting against things. There were various other texts, even Confucian texts, talked about how to deal with water, right? Because floods were a huge problem in China even way back then. So how do you deal with water? And one of the things was you have to go along with the way of water instead of fighting against it. This actually goes back to legends from, well, if they were true, they would go back to like 2000 BC or earlier than that even, I think, of these great floods. And one guy was appointed to fix the floods, and he kind of built all these dams, didn't go with the flow of the water, and it all collapsed and fell apart, and there were bad floods. And I think he was executed. And then his son was put in charge of it, and his son went along with the way of the water, which primarily was dredging and sort of opening up the channel so that the water could flow out. And he solved the problem, and he became the kind of the third emperor of China. He was sort of the third person. This guy controlled the floods. A third of the main themes would be the interdependence of opposites. And that works in a few different ways. So partly it's at the origins of things are the interplay of opposite forces, right? So that passage I quoted from The Great One Generates Water has it between yin and yang are the most famous ones of those pairs, right? I think it's quite a natural way to think about how things are generated, right? But they tended to think on the model of sex, right? So, I mean, that's how living things, as far as we know, living things are generated. They kind of just project that as the ultimate forces in the universe, right? And so that sort of, this interplay of opposites on a kind of natural or metaphysical kind of level. On the other side, their view is if you label one side, you automatically involve the other side, right? So chapter 2, another famous line says, when beauty is already recognized as beauty, then there's already ugliness. When good is already recognized as good, then there's the not good, right? So there's this idea that you can't have good without bad. You can't have one side without the other side. You really can't have success without failure also, right? These are always bound up with each other. There are strategies for dealing with that. I mean, part of the Dao De Jing, I think, is how to avoid that problem by always staying in the middle. You know, one theory about one strange thing is if these pairs are all complementary, why so much emphasis on softness instead of an equal emphasis on softness and force, right? And there's a few ways people try to explain that. One is that, we tend to be biased toward the forceful. So of course you want to emphasize the side that we tend to ignore. But part of it is written for rulers and for powerful people. And part of the idea seems to be if you're actually in a powerful position, to make that stable at all, you need to constantly cultivate the softness side and the humble side and all those kinds of things. Because if you just go with the strong position, that will collapse, right? So you want to maintain your position if you're a ruler, but to do that, you've got to be the opposite of what your position really is, right? And this is, a couple of passages mention, this is why rulers always call themselves the orphaned and the hungry, the starved, the lowly, to try to balance the fact that they have power, to make it more stable. I think this interdependence of opposites also connects to the critique of moralizing, right? Because the idea is that as soon as you start emphasizing like, oh, everybody needs to be good, you're really creating this dichotomy that also is creating badness, right? So another striking passage says, like, elevating the worthy again are the people translated as patriots in that one thing. Elevating the worthy will just cause people to compete and struggle against each other, right? It's a critique of really the kind of Confucian idea that what you do is set up good role models of good people, and everybody will try to be like them, and everybody will become good. It's really saying no, like that is just going to make actually everybody compete, and they'll actually be worse than if you didn't set up the role models in the first place. It's a fairly radical position, I mean, it's a pretty radical critique of morality in a lot of ways. And I think actually one of the interesting things in figuring out, how to interpret the Dao De Jing, how it gets all these meanings, one interesting example is how people take those critiques of morality. I want to talk next time about chapter 5, which is the heaven and earth are not humane chapter, heaven and earth are not benevolent, that line. What does that mean? Like some people translate it as that they're bad. could mean they're not deliberately moral, right? So one way to take the critique of morality is that, well, of course it's good to be moral, but you can only really be moral by not striving to be moral. You know, so you kind of keep the values in place, but say the key is to not promote them, not strive for them, and then they'll come about naturally. That's a kind of fairly mild way to read it, you know. A more radical way is to say that this really is a kind of amoral system that sees morality as bad, you know. It's interesting to see the different ways people struggle to interpret those kinds of things.
My translation says, heaven and earth are ruthless. That's how
Yeah.
it starts out.
Right. So that's right. So I'll give you a contrasting translation. Right. Roger Ames, I think, has heaven and earth do not support institutionalized morality. That sounds really different from ruthless, right? Another guy translates it as heaven and earth have no kin kindness. There he's trying to say it's a critique of kind of bias, right? But that's like three, so kin, I think it's kin kindness, that's not really a word, but kindness toward your close relatives, right? Heaven and earth don't have that. That's one reading. They're against sort of promoting morality or moralizing, you could say. That's another reading. That the ruthless is a very different sounding passage, you know. But yeah, it's a good example of
Out of those
that.
three, I kind of like the ruthless one the best, I think.
Yeah.
At least it's easier to understand from my point of view.
Yeah, it's the more radical one, too. You know, a more radical reading of it. That's, the book that Althea mentioned in the beginning, the title is from that chapter, and I translated it as not humane. I have reasons for that, too, you know, but I'll, that's one I want to talk about next time, and I'll bring some translations of it and show you different takes on it. But I guess, it brings up one of the things that divides interpretations is the Daodejing sometimes says things that are pretty radical and kind of hard to take. And so it's natural that people read it and think, oh, okay, it doesn't quite mean that. Like it means it's some other way that's more, not quite so hard to take, you know. But of course, what counts as hard to take depends completely on your perspective. So which one you have to modify and which ones you don't depends very much on what your concerns are in the first place. Actually, I'll just mention one other interesting example of that is the line that says, there's really two that say it, but one basically says that the best way to rule is to keep the people ignorant.
It's happening now.
Yeah. Right. Well, see, if you look at it that way, then we feel like, well, you know, if you like this book, you don't want it to say that. So how do you get around that, right? How do you get around that? And there are various ways to get around it. So to translate it as like simple, you know, that's, it could be what it means. The word literally means foolish. Like that's what the actual word means, but he could be using it in lots of different ways. You know, what it really means is hard to say. But that's another case where, especially in translation, people feel uncomfortable with that passage and try to find ways to get around that meaning of the passage.
What chapter is that? You know?
No, I don't know. I have a feeling it's in the 60s, but I don't remember. Other themes, okay, so the minimal government kind of just follows on the Wu Wei theme, right? So a general idea that's it's actually not just minimal government, minimal economy, all those kinds of things. Fairly simple sort of institutional structures is part of the view of the Tao Te Ching. The one passage says, you know, another famous passage says that the state should be small, it should have basically little technology. It ends by saying the people live close enough together that they can hear the dogs of...
The cup.
Thanks. The people live close enough together that they can hear the dogs barking from the next village, but they never go there. Yeah, so this idea that they're content, they're farmers, their life is simple, there are no big wars, there's no big oppression, you know, that's a kind of ideal of the Daodejing also. Cultivating the heart, this seems to be something, again, new to the time, well, again, it depends on when the Daodejing was written, but I would say new to these excavated texts that they found, right? Which is this focus on reducing desires, on a kind of internal simplicity. They use this word for simplicity that literally is uncarved wood, right? So sort of unadorned wood. Actually, the two main words they use are uncarved wood and undyed silk, are the two terms they use for something like a kind of internal simplicity. Before that, you have, critiques of certain kinds of desires, like, sensory pleasure, some of that, and sort of ideas you should have the right emotions. But this more radical, trying to empty the heart, free yourself from desires, that idea seems to be kind of new from the Daodejing. And then some element of physical cultivation. So there's pretty clearly physical practices being described in these texts. It's very hard to figure out what they are. I mean, when Althea and I were reading it together, it was interesting that she could see much more how this worked out and how it made sense in terms of physical practices. But there's several chapters that I think are clearly talking about some kind of physical practices. Controlling your breath particularly seems to be part of that. So that seems to be another sort of the main themes. Any questions on sort of themes, the key ideas, anything like that anybody want to ask?
Does this seem to be like in contrast or in a response to a very chaotic time? And I don't know if that's part of what you're really talking about or whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, it is. So you had a time that, one Chinese sort of famous intellectual, maybe a century ago, did an analysis and said over a 300-year span, there was not a single year without a civil war. Right.
Wow.
So if you think about that, and that was just the span he picked. I mean, that period of breakdown is really from around 700 BC to 221 BC. So it's about 500-year stretch. If you think about that, like that's where, like your great-great-grandparents have no memory of something of peace. You know what I mean? Like that's a long, long time to have continual war going on, and a lot of the time it was multiple wars going on, and like 5 or 6 states fighting together, and really awful conditions going on, And so, this is the birth of Chinese philosophy, really is not as, let's think about the meaning of life, but as like, how do we deal with these kinds of problems? And all the philosophers are trying to figure out how to deal with it. And one response is to reform the rulers, and most of them focus on unifying China under one ruler who's good, who's moral. I think the Tao Te Ching is taking, in a way, a more pessimistic view to say, that's not going to happen. And actually the problem is everybody thinking that they're going to be the good guy to unite everything. And that's why the wars are happening, is because people are using that as an excuse. And the sort of growth of the economy, whatever technology was developing at the time. The Tao Te Ching, I think, it's a fairly simple view that, having spent some time living in rural Tennessee, I can kind of see that people, just want to be left alone and can feel like, the bad things in the world are from these bigger power things, right? Like, people living in a farming village themselves, they don't want to go to war unless somebody's coming and taking their stuff. They don't want to go off to war, right? That's serving some greater power interest that you would have those kinds of wars. I think that's the perspective that the Tao Te Ching is coming at, In some ways it was already outdated in the sense that, like, kind of isolated farming villages were already being consumed by all these states, and China went the route of unification and was unified after that. But that's the ideal it's looking back to, really, as if everybody, in a way, trying to say if everybody tries to stop fixing things, it will be fine. Because I think it's interesting, all these early Chinese philosophers have a view that there's enough stuff for everybody to have what they need if we stop having wars and certain people stop taking more than they need. They pretty much all have that view, so they don't really have a view of natural scarcity. You know what I mean? This is why, like, I wrote this book on the problem of evil. They don't focus much on, like, famines, natural famines and that kind of stuff, because they really tend to think, like, nature itself will give us what we need. If you work all the time farming, you'll get what you need and it will work out. And it's just that human beings keep messing it up, and so they have this sense that, you just need to stop people from messing it up, and then things will be fine, And again, I think the Taoist view was like, even the people who say they want to fix it are actually contributing to the problem. Really, everybody just needs to stop trying to fix it and just mind their own business and take care of themselves, and then we'll have this sort of decent life, you know, simple life, but decent life. Yeah.
Did Buddhism arise around the same time? And how would you say is like the main contrast? Because they, in my mind, I almost kind of have this sense that they're almost interchangeable in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And Buddhism arose around the same time in India, right? So it comes into China, you know, around the beginning of the Common Era. So it's not totally clear, but the 1st century AD, you have Buddhism in China already. I think it's pretty certain the time of the Dao De Jing, there was no contact with Buddhism. It hadn't spread at all at that point. The contrasts, I think the main contrast is Buddhism is much more, how would you put it? I don't want to say idealistic or extreme or what I'm thinking. I mean, Buddhism has this, a much more sort of absolutist approach where you would totally eliminate desires. The Chinese philosophers and the Taoist philosophers have much more a sense of like moderation, like you'll minimize, reduce desires some, but you're not going to be completely free of desires or something
Well,
like that.
one of the big tenets like in Buddhism is the they espouse the middle path, you know.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, but it's not, it's a middle path in some ways and not other ways, right? It's a middle path between, the original meaning of it seems to have been between sort of torturing your body and just seeking pleasure, right? And so you don't do either of those. You meditate, those kinds of things, but you don't do kinds of things like,
Sounds like Tantra.
which one sounds like Tantra?
That, a lot of it. Action, no action.
Yeah, and Tantra is more positive toward the body, right? So Buddhism uses the body, you know, and it's very much embodied practices. Of course, meditation is embodied practices, but I think it has, you know, this is why I keep pausing, is there are so many different forms of Buddhism, it's really hard to generalize about Buddhism, you know, so each time I'm about to say something, I think, okay, but yeah, that's not true of this kind of Buddhism, that's not true of this kind. I would say Buddhism is it's much more kind of systematic and kind of absolutist, and the Chinese view is much more pragmatic and more moderate, I would say. You know, so you don't have any like even clear idea. You have people who became hermits and that kind of stuff, but you don't have any articulation of the, you know, leaving and joining a sangha kind of community early on in Chinese stuff. You know, you don't have that kind of setting up of rules and that kind of systematization of these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that the thing that makes Daoism really different is that you can be almost any kind of Daoist. You can be an ecstatic, you can be an ascetic, you can get drunk and write poetry. All of those were legitimate forms, and Buddhism it has much more of a discrete path.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think it is much more, and when Buddhism deviates from that, it's partly Taoist influence on it, I would
Well,
say.
that's-
So I mean, you do like in
Yeah.
Chan Zen Buddhism, you do have, you know, some drinking and that kind of stuff, but that's partly Taoist influence, you know, once it gets into China and gets merged in with Chinese stuff.
One of the other differences, I think, is that Buddhism non-attachment is. I remember Olivia Cohen talking about how when Buddhism first began to set up monasteries in China, and you were supposed to leave your home and join the monastery, and the Chinese were so horrified because these were then people without families, and so they finally resolved it by deciding that Buddha's last name was Li, and anybody who went into a monastery took the name of Li so that they would have a family. And that's like a kind of a
Yeah,
very Chinese thing to
pragmatic
do.
Chineseness, yeah. There's a great line in Mencius, this Confucian, where he says, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he says something like, basically says, if the government is not benefiting the people, then you should get rid of that government, roughly that. And then he says, if people are, you know, making sacrifices to the gods, the ghosts and spirits, but they're not getting benefits, get rid of those gods and spirits. You know? And I think he means it in it's a very practical view. Like, yeah, there are these spirits there, and you do your stuff, and they're supposed to respond. And if they don't, get rid of them and get other spirits, right? And sacrifice to those spirits and find something that works. And it's a very practical kind of Chinese orientation toward religion, I think.
So would you say like the Taoists today are kind of like the whole Catholic spectrum, that there's many different offshoots, and that's how they rectify all the different translations kind of thing?
I think you could make a fairly strong distinction between Daoism as a kind of private thing that people read these books and get inspiration from it, right? And then that can be read in all different kinds of ways, you know, depending on what people's interests are, what their assumptions are. It gets translated in all these different ways. Versus Daoism as a kind of official religious structure, which there is in China. There's some dispute right now about who's going to be the head of it, right? If you're that and you're like an ordained Taoist priest, that has very set rules and a kind of, they're not that set, but it has sort of demands of a certain hierarchy and that kind of thing. Outside of that, you have people reading it, you know, for whatever purpose, from all different kinds of perspectives. You know. For contemporary Taoism, Althea actually knows, I think, more than I do about contemporary practices. You know, there's traditionally what people talk about a split between philosophical Taoism and religious Taoism, and it's been critiqued a lot by scholars because it seems like the philosophical Taoist stuff still has assumptions that get drawn out more in the religious Taoism, like physical practices that really are part of Taoism in any form, you know. But there still is a kind of distinction between them, I think, you know, between the more philosophical reading and the more religious kind of practice. And, you know, some of that will come out when we look at some of the Shanghai commentary and that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, and the idea that Taoism as a religious practice in modern times has a kind of a structure is actually very new, and it's being promoted by the Chinese government, largely because they finally figured out that they couldn't eradicate the religious impulse, so they said, let's do an indigenous one.
Yeah.
So now they have things like they've started up religious orders and, you know, the Kundao, the priestesses, and they're being funded by the government. Yeah, but but in traditional China, that was, I mean, every temple was different.
Right. Yeah, you have lineages around different temples.
Exactly,
And, that kind of
and the
stuff.
lineages could be wildly different, and northern and southern Taoist traditions were wildly different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it takes on all kinds of forms, even within what you might call religious Taoism, you know. But it has been, now there is one, there's like the Taoist Pope, basically, like in China. And there's disputes now about who it should be and that kind of stuff. Let me make one more point, I think, and then, well, okay, maybe two more points, sorry. I put this, right, this is a famous passage, right, and this is on this idea of the Tao as origin, right, so the Tao generates one generates two generates three generates the myriad things, and the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things shoulder yin and embrace yang, blending vital energies to create harmony. Right, so the Tao, again, is the ultimate origin. The first product is the oneness. The character for generate could mean to give birth to grow. It's actually a picture of a sprout coming out of the ground, is the character itself. What's interesting is one of those excavated texts, they found this passage that just says, it's heard that one generates two generates three generates the feminine generates bonds. The last part with the feminine and the bonds is very hard to figure out what that's about. There's a lot of disputes about it. Like I said, this hasn't been translated. This is my translation. What's interesting, though, is that it starts with the one. And this seems to be an innovation of the Daodejing, is to say the ultimate is not really the one, because that's already sort of conceptualized and labeled in a certain way. The ultimate even is before the one. And it's Wu, it's non-being, those kinds of things, right? So this idea of the Tao as the ultimate seems to be a kind of particular position being put forward in the Dao De Jing to say that the ultimate can't be labeled as one, it can't be grasped in any way. We can refer to it as the way or the guide, right? But it really is before even the idea of the one. And this is also just kind of a neat example of how these texts play against each other. This is that same text, and it talks about the importance of knowing the white, which seems to mean something like knowing the pure. The line then gets taken up in the Dao De Jing, where it says, yeah, okay, know the white, but preserve the sullied. Right? Know the white, but preserve the dark. And it seems to be, again, a kind of critique radicalization of this earlier point that's in this other text, to say, yeah, okay, that's right, you do want to be pure, but if you're just trying to be pure, that's going to be bad, right? You also need to preserve the dark or the sullied or the bad. This is then actually the last thing I'll say, because this will kind of set up more for next time. This is trying to think about the ways in which different meanings come out of the Dao De Jing, right? So one is different base texts, right? And I said the two main ones are Mawangdui and Guodian, but so sometimes that's why two translations will differ, is they're actually translating different Chinese texts. Another one is that a lot of the characters have many different meanings. And sometimes, in fact, people think it's the wrong character and it was a character that sounded the same, and those kinds of things. So that's another place where you get a lot of these ambiguities. The grammar is often ambiguous, and the original had no punctuation. So next time we'll talk about chapter 1, but that has a famous dispute about punctuation in how to read chapter 1, whether it's the nameless or, well, we'll talk about it next time, that one. On a broader level, how to read the different images or metaphors. So a good example of that is, I think it's chapter 60, that starts off by saying, govern a state like cooking a small fish. And like you read that, it's like, what does that mean? What is special about cooking a small fish? That, like, what's the lesson out of cooking a small fish? And most people take it as saying, don't do too much. So the idea is if you cook a small fish and you keep flipping it over, it'll fall apart, but I don't know if that's even true. I don't know what it means, but that's the case where you get all kinds of interpretations out of this metaphor. Things that seem to be originally contradictory or don't fit, then you have to find creative ways to fit them together. That's part of what brings out different readings. And then, of course, the step to English. Of course, that opens up all kinds of possibilities for variations and for change. And so, the handout has some examples of those on it, but I think maybe I'll stop there, and then I'll talk about some of that next time, also next week. So I'll just take questions if people have questions about any aspect. Yeah.
So with the Wu Wei and the not doing but not doing, I'm trying to understand that. Would that be a way of thinking of about being or being conscious but not going unconscious, or does? I'm just trying to grasp that one.
Yeah, it's hard to say really in practice what it means, but I think that's partly because it could work on a number of different levels, right? So I think on one level, what speaks about that is, wanting something to happen and thinking that you have to force it to happen or make it happen. And then this text is saying, don't just do that, right? Pull back, allow things to develop of themselves, on a kind of very practical level. On a more almost mystical level or something like that, it might be playing on ideas of skill. And what I mean is that another Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, has examples of people who do various skills. One is a butcher cutting up an ox, but there's somebody who is going down rapids in a boat, right? In those kinds of situations, right, you are doing stuff, right, but just responding to what's happening. You're not deciding what to do. You're just reacting to things in a very skillful way. Playing music is a good example of that, right? Where I studied classical guitar, and I would always, whenever I had to play for my instructor, my final exam would be horrible. I would be so good back in my room, and then I would go there, or I was actually never very good, but I'd be much better in my room than when I went in. Because when I was playing by myself, I could just kind of just forget about it and just play. And then if I started thinking about it, it would get all messed up, right? So there might be some idea of taking that kind of experience and more extending that through your life. Although it's hard to imagine what that would mean to do that all the time, Although the interesting thing is that we do it probably a lot more than we think, right? Because even something like my answering you, right? I'm largely just spontaneously speaking. If I were every time trying to think of what I'm going to say, I wouldn't be able to talk. You know, like a good conversation is spontaneous like that too. So I think it might have some, like, so there's a practical level of not forcing things too much and that kind of strategy. There might be some higher idea of a kind of almost absorption in the moment, let's say, you know.
That's really helpful, thanks.
Other questions?
Is the order of these chapters, is that agreed upon, or is that kind of up in the air as well as the versions?
It's in the, all of the received texts have the same order. So it's only the excavated texts that have a different orders.
Excavated meaning the
the-
ones they recently found?
Yeah, right. So the ones they found in the past like 30 or 40 years, those have different orders. So most people will translate it, almost all translations have the same order, but some people who translate the, like that Mawangdui silk manuscript will follow that order. In which case, basically the last half is first.
And what was that again, that just found that?
I think they found Mawangdui in the early 70s, I think is when they found that. The bamboo text was 93, I think they found that, so that's very recent. The Mawangdui silk stuff, I think, was in the early, like 73, I think, early 70s. Any other questions? All right, we stop there.
It was great. Thank you.